There are times in life when the path ahead feels unclear, uncertain, or even impossible. You look at your circumstances, your challenges, your struggles, and wonder, how in the world am I going to make it through this? You feel like you've reached the end of your rope, like you've hit a wall that's just too high to climb. But what I want to remind you of today is that even when it seems like there's no way forward, God is still working, still moving, still making a way where there appears to be none. We've all had those moments where we felt stuck. The bills keep piling up, the relationships seem to be falling apart, and you feel like you've given all you've got, but nothing is changing. The world tells you to give up, to settle, to accept things as they are, but God has a different plan. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who made a way for the Israelites in the wilderness, is still in the business of making a way for his people today. I want you to hold on to that truth. God will make a way for you. You might not see it right now. You might not feel it in the moment, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. In fact, some of the greatest breakthroughs in your life are going to come when you least expect them. When you feel like you're at your weakest, when you feel like you've got nothing left to give, that's when God steps in and shows you that he's been working behind the scenes all along. Think about the story of Joseph. He had a dream when he was young, a dream that seemed impossible. His brothers hated him. His father didn't understand him, and life was nothing like he had imagined it would be. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. It seemed like every door was closing, every opportunity was slipping through his fingers. But all along, God had a plan. When Joseph couldn't see a way out, God was already making a way. The same God who gave him the dream was the one who positioned him in the right place at the right time to fulfill that dream. And when Joseph finally stood before Pharaoh, the very one who had the power to elevate him, he realized that the way forward had been in God's hands the entire time. That's the kind of God we serve. He's the God who makes a way where there seems to be no way. He doesn't need to consult with your circumstances or ask for your permission. He's already got it figured out. Even when you're in the pit, God is working to lift you up. Even when you're stuck in the prison of your problems, God is orchestrating things behind the scenes to bring you to the palace of your purpose. We see this in the life of Moses as well. He had a destiny to lead God's people out of slavery, but his journey wasn't easy. He had to face Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world at that time. Moses didn't have an army, he didn't have resources, and he didn't have a way to force Pharaoh to let the people go. All he had was a word from God, and that word was enough. Moses didn't have to figure out how it would happen. He just had to trust that God would make a way, and God did. He parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites walked through on dry land. God didn't need Moses to have all the answers. He didn't need Moses to have a plan B. He just needed Moses to have faith. And when Moses stepped out in faith, God did the impossible. When you step out in faith, God will do the impossible for you. It doesn't matter how impossible your situation seems. It doesn't matter how many times you failed before. God will make a way for you. Sometimes the hardest part is simply trusting that God is working when we can't see it. It's easy to trust when things are going well, when the path ahead seems clear, but what do we do when the road is rocky and uncertain? That's when faith really kicks in. When everything around you is falling apart and you feel like you're walking in the dark, that's when God is most at work. He's not intimidated by your obstacles. He's not scared of your doubts. He's not worried about your fears. He is the creator of the universe, the one who spoke the world into existence, and he is fully capable of making a way for you no matter what you're facing. God isn't limited by time, by resources, or by your human understanding. His ways are beyond our comprehension, but they are always good. He will never leave you stranded. He will never forsake you. Even when you can't see the road ahead, He is there making a way for you. And the moment you realize that, the moment you let go of your own understanding and trust in His plan, that's when you'll see things begin to shift. I know that it's easy to look at your situation and think, I can't do this. This is too much for me. But the truth is, you don't have to do it on your own. You don't have to rely on your own strength or your own ability. God is with you. He is the one who will make a way when there seems to be no way. You are not in this alone. And when you lean on Him, when you trust in His promises, you will begin to see doors open that you never thought possible. Sometimes, though, the way that God makes is not the way we expect. We think that the solution will come in a certain form, in a certain way, but God doesn't always work according to our plans. He might make a way in a way that you never imagined, but it will always be better than what you could have planned for yourself. Trust Him even when things don't make sense. Trust that He knows what He's doing. He's been making a way for His people from the very beginning, and He will continue to make a way for you, even when it feels like there's no hope. Remember that God's timing is perfect. Just because things aren't happening on your timetable doesn't mean that God isn't working. He's always at work, behind the scenes, orchestrating things in your favor. When it seems like nothing is changing, that's often when God is doing His deepest work in you. He's preparing you for something bigger, something greater than you could ever imagine. And when you look back on your life, you'll be able to see how every moment, every trial, every setback, every challenge was part of the journey that brought you to where you are. You'll see how God used even the hardest moments to shape you, to strengthen you, and to position you for the breakthrough that He had planned all along. There's power in knowing that God will make a way. It gives you hope when things seem hopeless. It gives you peace when everything around you is chaotic. It gives you the strength to keep going when you feel like giving up. And when you hold on to that truth, when you trust in His ability to make a way, that's when you'll experience the miraculous in your life. You might be facing a situation right now that feels impossible. You might be staring at a mountain that looks too high to climb, too steep to conquer. But remember this, the God who made a way for the Israelites through the Red Sea, the God who brought Joseph from the pit to the palace, the God who parted the waters for Moses. He's the same God who is making a way for you. He's the same God who is working on your behalf, even when you can't see it. Even when you can't feel it. He is always working, always moving, always making a way. So hold on to that truth today. Trust that God will make a way for you, even when you can't see the way forward, even when it feels like you've reached the end. Know that God has a plan and He is making a way. You don't have to figure it all out. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to trust that God is working, and when the time is right, He will make a way. Even when we can't see a way forward, God is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating things in our favor and preparing us for the breakthrough we need. God's ways and timing are always perfect. Even when things don't go according to our expectations, we must trust that He has a greater plan for us and that He will make a way in His perfect timing. No matter how impossible or uncertain the situation may seem, when we have faith and trust in God's ability, He will make a way for us, just as He has done for His people throughout history. When we're facing struggles or feeling stuck, it's easy to feel like God is distant, like He's not paying attention to our needs or our circumstances. It's as if we're all alone, struggling to find a way out, and nothing seems to be changing. But even in those moments, when we can't see it, when we don't feel it, God is always working behind the scenes. His hand is at work, even when we're unaware of it. Think about the story of Esther in the Bible. Esther was an orphan who found herself in the middle of a perilous situation. The Jewish people were at risk of being wiped out by the decree of a powerful king, and Esther, who had become the queen, had the opportunity to stand up for her people. But this wasn't a simple situation. She had to be careful. The king could have easily ordered her death if she approached him without being summoned. The stakes were incredibly high, but the most amazing part of the story is that God's presence is never explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther. Yet throughout the entire story, God is clearly working behind the scenes, orchestrating events in a way that no one could have predicted. The timing of Esther's rise to the throne, the way the king couldn't sleep the night before Esther's request, the way Haman's plan to destroy the Jews turned on its head, it all shows how God was working even when his name wasn't directly mentioned. In our own lives, God works in similar ways. There are countless times we might be facing difficult situations, wondering how things will ever change, only to look back later and realize that God was positioning us, guiding us, and working out the details in ways we couldn't understand at the time. The moments we think are random or insignificant might actually be God's way of leading us to exactly where we need to be. We've all had those times where things don't make sense. You've prayed and asked for help, but it feels like nothing's happening. You wonder, why isn't God doing something about this? Why does it feel like I'm being ignored? But even when you can't see it, God is moving. He is arranging things in ways that you may never understand in the moment. It's often in the quiet, unseen moments that God is doing his most significant work. Think about Joseph once again. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. In that moment, it seemed like God had forgotten about him. It seemed like everything was going wrong, and Joseph's dream of being in a position of leadership was only slipping further away. But what Joseph couldn't see at the time was that God was positioning him for something greater. Every hardship he went through, every unfair situation was part of God's plan. God was setting up the circumstances for Joseph to be in the right place at the right time to help save not only his own family, but an entire nation. In the moment, Joseph didn't understand why things were happening the way they were. But later, when he stood before his brothers and revealed who he was, he realized that it wasn't just about him. God was at work behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for his greater purpose. This is how God works in our lives too. We may not see the full picture. We may not understand why we're going through the struggles or why things seem to be falling apart. But in the midst of it all, God is making a way. He's working things out in ways that we can't even imagine. The people you meet, the situations you encounter, the challenges you face, all of them may seem random or unrelated, but God is using them to position you for something greater. You don't have to see how it will all come together. You just have to trust that God is at work. There are moments in life when it feels like everything is falling apart. Relationships fail, opportunities slip away, and dreams seem out of reach. In those moments, it's easy to wonder if God even sees you, let alone cares about what you're going through. But that's where faith comes in. Even when you don't see it, even when you can't understand how things will work out, you have to trust that God sees the bigger picture. He sees what you can't see, he knows what you don't know, and he is making a way for you, even when you can't feel it. It's easy to forget that God is working behind the scenes when we're caught up in the noise of our circumstances. We look at what's in front of us, the obstacles, the challenges, and wonder how we'll ever get through. But that's when we have to trust that God is doing what we cannot. He's working things out in ways that are beyond our comprehension. And his timing is always perfect. Even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are, we can trust that God's plan is bigger than anything we could ever imagine. Sometimes the hardest part is waiting. waiting for God to reveal what he's doing behind the scenes. We want immediate answers, immediate solutions, but God's timing isn't our timing. We can't rush his plans, but when the time is right, when everything has come together in his perfect way, we will look back and see how he worked all things together for our good. Even the tough times, even the struggles were part of his plan. In the end, we have to trust that God is always at work. He is never absent. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, he's working behind the scenes, lining up the perfect opportunities, changing hearts, and preparing us for what's to come. And when we walk by faith, when we trust that God is working, even when we can't see it, we will begin to notice the ways he is making a way for us. We'll see how everything has been orchestrated perfectly in his timing, and we'll realize that every step we've taken, every challenge we've faced has been part of his bigger plan to bring us to where we need to be. Trusting in God's timing and plan can be one of the most challenging aspects of faith. It's easy to trust when things are going well, when everything aligns perfectly and the path ahead is clear. But what about those times when the road ahead seems foggy, when everything feels uncertain, or when it feels like God's timing is completely different from what we expected? It's in those moments that trusting God becomes not just an act of faith, but a deep intentional choice to rely on his wisdom and trust in his perfect timing, even when it doesn't make sense to us. God's plan for our lives is often far greater than we can imagine. It's also important to remember that just because something isn't happening right now doesn't mean it won't happen at all. God's delays are not his denials. Sometimes we may feel like we've been waiting for years with no progress, and it's easy to start wondering if God even heard our prayers. But the Bible reminds us that God's promises are always yes and amen. The delay in the fulfillment of our prayers doesn't mean the answer is no. It simply means that God is preparing us for something bigger, something better, something that will come at the right time. In the waiting, we are being shaped, refined, and strengthened. Ultimately, trusting in God's timing and plan means surrendering our own agenda to his. It means acknowledging that his understanding and wisdom far surpass our own. When we trust in his timing, we release the pressure of trying to figure everything out ourselves. We surrender our worries, our frustrations, and our need for control. And instead, we place our trust in the one who knows what is best for us. It's in that surrender that we find freedom, the freedom to trust, to rest, and to know that God will bring his plan to pass in the perfect way and at the perfect time. God's timing may not always match our expectations, but it will always be worth the wait. Trusting in his plan means embracing the journey, even when the road is long and the destination isn't yet clear. It means believing that God's purposes for us are greater than what we can see right now, and trusting that he will guide us every step of the way. When we let go of our need to control and embrace his plan, we begin to experience the peace and assurance that comes from knowing we are in the hands of a loving, sovereign God. Faith in the impossible is one of the most powerful expressions of belief in God's greatness. It is the kind of faith that goes beyond the natural, the rational, and the logical. It's the kind of faith that believes that nothing is impossible for God, no matter how dire or hopeless a situation may seem. This kind of faith doesn't rely on what we can see or what we can control. It relies on the unshakable belief that God, the creator of the universe, can do things that we could never imagine. It's easy to have faith in something that seems within reach, something that makes sense to our human minds. But faith in the impossible calls us to believe in things that seem too big, too far-fetched, and sometimes even unreasonable. It's the kind of faith that dares to believe that God can heal a sickness when doctors say there is no cure. It's the kind of faith that dares to believe that God can restore a broken relationship, even when the odds are stacked against it. It's the kind of faith that dares to believe that God can open doors of opportunity when every door has been slammed shut. The Bible is full of stories of people who had faith in the impossible. One of the most remarkable is the story of Abraham, who was promised by God that he would be the father of many nations. The problem? Abraham was well over 100 years old, and his wife, Sarah, was past the age of childbearing. Everything in the natural world screamed that it was impossible. Yet, Abraham didn't waver in his faith. He believed God's promise despite the overwhelming odds. And against all expectations, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, fulfilling God's promise. Abraham's faith didn't depend on his ability to understand how it would happen. It depended on God's ability to do the impossible. Another powerful example is the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. After being freed from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. There seemed to be no way out, but Moses, led by God, raised his staff and the waters parted. The Israelites walked through on dry land and they were safely on the other side before the waters returned and swallowed up Pharaoh's army. To human eyes, it was impossible. But with God, nothing is impossible. The Israelites didn't see a way out, but God made a way where there seemed to be none. Faith in the impossible calls us to trust that God's power is greater than our limitations. It calls us to believe that God can do what we cannot. When we face situations that seem impossible, we can either let fear and doubt take over, or we can trust that God is bigger than our circumstances. It's easy to give in to the feeling that the situation is beyond repair, that we've reached a point where no solution exists. But faith in the impossible challenges us to look beyond the limitations of what we can see and trust in God's ability to intervene. The story of David and Goliath is another incredible example of faith in the impossible. David, a young shepherd, stood before Goliath, a giant of a man who had taunted the armies of Israel for days. No one, not even King Saul, believed that David had a chance. But David didn't see the situation the way others did. He didn't see a giant. He saw a God who was greater than any giant. His faith in God's power led him to stand against Goliath with only a slingshot and a few stones. And with one stone, David defeated Goliath, proving that faith in God's power can conquer even the most impossible odds. Faith in the impossible is not about denying the reality of the situation. It's about acknowledging the reality of God's power. When we have faith in the impossible, we are not ignoring the fact that things may seem bleak or overwhelming. Instead, we are choosing to believe that God is able to turn things around, even when it seems like there is no way forward. We are choosing to trust that God's plan is bigger than what we can see in the moment, and that He has the power to bring good out of what seems like a hopeless situation. Sometimes faith in the impossible requires us to take a step forward even when we don't know what's on the other side. It means trusting that God will catch us when we leap, that He will make a way even when the road ahead seems unclear. It's about stepping out in faith, not because we have all the answers, but because we trust the one who does. Like Peter walking on the water toward Jesus, faith in the impossible means leaving behind our comfort zone and taking that step into the unknown, believing that God will provide what we need along the way. It's important to remember that faith in the impossible is not just about asking God to do miraculous things for us. It's also about believing that He can do miraculous things in us. When we have faith in the impossible, it transforms our hearts and minds. It helps us to see the world through the lens of God's power, not just our own limitations. It helps us to trust that God is always working, even when we can't see the outcome. And it empowers us to move forward with boldness, knowing that with God, there is no such thing as an impossible situation. Having faith in the impossible doesn't mean that we won't face challenges. It doesn't mean that we won't encounter times of doubt or fear. But it does mean that even in those moments, we can choose to trust that God is at work. We can choose to believe that God is bigger than any obstacle, bigger than any problem, and bigger than any circumstance. Faith in the impossible is the belief that God is able to do what we cannot. It is the belief that He can make a way where there seems to be no way, that He can turn around any situation, and that He can do more than we could ever ask or imagine. When we embrace this kind of faith, we are not just waiting for a miracle to happen. We are choosing to walk with confidence, knowing that nothing is too difficult for God. We are choosing to trust in His power, in His love, and in His ability to make the impossible possible. With faith in the impossible, we can face anything because we know that with God, all things are possible.